On a bright, quiet morning at the luxurious Green Valley Country Club, no one expected anything unusual to happen, until one misunderstanding spiraled into a moment that would shock everyone present. Welcome back to Swift Tale, the channel where real-life stories meet powerful lessons, and where every twist keeps you thinking long after the video ends. And if you're visiting for the first time, let me ask you something. Have you liked, shared, and subscribed yet? If not, make sure you do, because today's story is one you absolutely don't want to miss. It begins with a respected black man simply enjoying his day, walking peacefully across the golf course he was fully authorized to be on. Yet within minutes, an aggressive police officer would confront him, assumptions would replace facts, and bias would ignite a dangerous situation. Things escalated so badly that the officer actually swung a golf club at him, an act so shocking that onlookers froze. But what happened next stunned everyone. The man calmly reached inside his jacket, pulled out his identification, and revealed a badge that changed everything. The officer who moments earlier had attacked him instantly dropped the golf club, his face draining of color as he realized the monumental mistake he had just made. This story matters because it reflects a painful reality that many people face daily, being judged not by who they are but by what someone assumes them to be. It shows how quickly bias can turn a simple moment into a dangerous one, and how a lack of restraint from those in power can threaten innocent lives. And yet, this story also reveals something powerful: the strength of composure, the importance of truth, and the shocking ways justice can unfold when the truth can't be ignored. So settle in, because what started as a peaceful walk on a golf course is about to unravel into a chain of events involving accusations, panic, investigations, and consequences no one saw coming. This is the unbelievable tale of the police officer who attacked the wrong man, and the twist that exposed everything. The day had begun like any other at the prestigious Green Valley Country Club, a place known for its carefully trimmed lawns, shimmering ponds, and the soft clinking of glasses as members enjoyed their peaceful weekend routine. Sunlight drifted across the rolling hills, casting long shadows over the perfectly manicured fairways where golfers strolled with calm, deliberate steps. Everything about the atmosphere suggested comfort, exclusivity, and ease, an environment where no one expected conflict, and certainly not the kind that would later bring national attention. Among the members was Adrian Brooks, a man whose quiet confidence blended seamlessly with the refined setting. Wearing a simple polo, tailored slacks, and a calm expression, he looked like any experienced golfer heading toward the course for a relaxing round. No one would have guessed from his demeanor that he held one of the highest-level federal badges in the country. To him, this wasn't about prestige. It was about enjoying a rare day off, taking a deep breath, and letting the world slow down for just a moment. Adrian had chosen this club specifically because of its privacy. As a federal agent who worked undercover more than he worked behind a desk, he valued places where he could disappear into the background, where he didn't have to think about danger, suspicion, or the chaotic unpredictability of his job. Here, surrounded by the quiet rustling of trees and the gentle rhythm of golf swings, he could finally breathe. And until that moment, everything was perfect. But peace, as Adrian would soon learn, can be fragile, especially when it depends on the assumptions of others. Just a few holes away, another man watched him with narrowed eyes, misreading Adrian's presence entirely. And while Adrian simply continued walking toward the next tee, unaware of the storm forming in the distance, fate was already shifting. As Adrian continued strolling across the fairway, enjoying the breeze that carried the faint scent of fresh-cut grass, a quiet tension began stirring at the edge of the property. A police cruiser rolled to a stop near the club's entrance, responding to what had been described over dispatch as a possible trespasser. The reporting club member claimed a suspicious black man was wandering near the greens, a description loaded with assumptions and stripped of context. Officer Daniel Cray stepped out of the car, his jaw tight, eyes scanning the horizon with a certainty that he was already confronting a threat. He didn't ask additional questions, didn't request clarification, and didn't wait for backup. Instead, he latched onto the caller's tone, fearful, irritated, and entitled, and let it shape his entire mindset. As he walked toward the course, Daniel spotted Adrian in the distance. To him, Adrian's relaxed posture was somehow suspicious. His calm walk appeared purposeful in a way Daniel interpreted as evasive. His hand occasionally reaching to adjust his glove looked like a concealed movement. Every harmless detail became exaggerated in Daniel's mind, fueled by the complaint and by the quiet biases he never acknowledged. Rather than observing, he judged. Rather than questioning, he assumed. And as he approached, his demeanor shifted from professional to confrontational, shoulders squared and hand hovering near his equipment belt. Meanwhile, Adrian remained unaware that he was being watched like a criminal, completely absorbed in the simple pleasure of preparing for his next swing. Officer Daniel's pace quickened. The mild irritation brewing in his expression revealed what he believed he was walking into, a situation where he would be the hero restoring order. But in reality, he was walking into a confrontation of his own creation. And with every step, the gap between truth and assumption grew dangerously wide. Officer Daniel closed the distance with heavy, purposeful steps, his voice cutting sharply through the calm air long before he reached Adrian. "Hey. You stop right there," he barked, the kind of command meant for criminals fleeing a scene, not for a man quietly lining up a practice swing. Adrian turned slowly, confusion flickering across his face as he lowered his club. Nothing about him signaled danger, yet Daniel approached with an aggression that seemed to grow with every breath. "What are you doing here?" the officer demanded, bypassing courtesy, skipping protocol, and jumping straight into accusation. Adrian attempted to answer politely, explaining that he was a member of the club and simply enjoying a round, but Daniel cut him off, waving a dismissive hand as if the words were nothing more than excuses. The tension thickened as club members began to gather at a distance, drawn by the officer's raised voice. Some watched with discomfort, recognizing Adrian and knowing he belonged there, while others folded their arms, ready to assume he was in the wrong simply because the officer said so. Daniel's questions became sharper, louder, and more hostile. He accused Adrian of trespassing, of refusing to follow instructions, even of attempting to sneak around the property, claims rooted in nothing but the officer's own imagination. Adrian remained composed, his calm voice a stark contrast to the escalating hostility, but every attempt at explanation only seemed to irritate Daniel more. It was as though Adrian's composure challenged him, pushing him toward a level of aggression that no situation, especially this one, could possibly justify. Minutes passed that felt like hours, the officer's tone growing more menacing, his posture more threatening. Adrian felt the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders, a familiar heaviness he had experienced in other parts of his life, but hoped he would never feel in a place meant for peace. He tried once more to de-escalate, offering to retrieve his membership card from his bag, but Daniel's eyes flashed with suspicion instead of reason. To the officer, every normal gesture Adrian made seemed like defiance, even though he hadn't defied a single instruction. And as Daniel stepped closer, tension radiated outward like a warning no one wanted to hear. Things were about to take a dangerous turn. The breaking point arrived with stunning speed. As Adrian reached slowly toward his golf bag, clearly stating he was retrieving his membership card, Officer Daniel misinterpreted the movement entirely. His face twisted with a mix of paranoia and adrenaline, and before anyone could understand what was happening, he lunged forward and grabbed a golf club from the cart beside them. Gasps rippled through the small cluster of onlookers as he gripped it tightly, knuckles whitening, the polished metal gleaming beneath the sun. "Don't move," he shouted, raising the club as though he were fending off a violent attacker rather than a calm man standing frozen in shock. Adrian's eyes widened, his body instinctively tightening, not out of guilt, but out of fear for how dangerously out of control the situation had become. The officer's breathing grew ragged, his stance shifting into one of unstable aggression. He swung the club downward toward Adrian, not making contact, but close enough that the whoosh of air brushed Adrian's shoulder. The crowd erupted in shouts, some calling for the officer to stop, others scrambling backward in alarm. Adrian stood still, hands raised slightly, his composure stretched thin but not yet broken. "Officer, please listen to me," he said steadily, forcing each word to come out calm despite the panic clawing at his chest. But Daniel wasn't listening. His mind was locked into a narrative he had created, one where he was confronting a dangerous intruder, one where force felt justified. He paced in a tight circle, the club lifted like a weapon, his voice trembling from a cocktail of nerves, bias, and power. In that moment, time seemed to slow. The birds that had been chirping moments before fell silent. The wind stilled. Club members stood frozen, some filming on their phones, others too stunned to even raise their devices. The peaceful luxury of the golf course had transformed into a scene of raw hostility, all because an officer had let assumptions dictate his actions. Adrian knew that one wrong move could escalate this from frightening to fatal. The weight of that reality pressed down on him, but he also knew that he held something the officer did not expect, something that could flip the entire situation in an instant. For now, though, he held still, waiting for the sliver of opportunity that would arrive only when the officer's adrenaline began to crack. At the height of the chaos, when the officer's grip tightened on the golf club and the crowd's anxious murmurs filled the air, Adrian realized he had no choice but to assert the truth in the clearest way possible. Slowly, keeping his hands visible and movements deliberate, he reached toward the inner pocket of his jacket. The officer immediately jerked backward, raising the club again as if preparing for a full swing. "I said don't move," Daniel barked, his voice cracking under the pressure of the moment. But Adrian didn't flinch. He understood that fear, bias, and adrenaline had merged into something dangerous, and that calm, controlled action was the only path out. Then, with one smooth motion, Adrian pulled out his badge, a gleaming federal credential encased in leather, unmistakable in its design and authority. The sunlight caught its edges, casting a sharp reflection across Daniel's stunned expression. The crowd fell silent. The officer's entire body seemed to lock in disbelief as his eyes darted from the badge to Adrian's face and back again. The golf club that moments earlier had been wielded like a weapon slipped from his hand, clattering onto the concrete path with a metallic ring that echoed across the course. Whatever story Daniel had created in his mind shattered instantly. Adrian spoke evenly, his voice steady but firm. "I'm a federal agent, and I am a member of this club," he said, holding the badge forward so even the onlookers could see the truth he had been trying to communicate from the beginning. A wave of realization washed over the small crowd. Faces paled. Some members exchanged embarrassed glances. Others shook their heads in disbelief at how quickly things had spiraled from a simple misunderstanding to a near attack, all because the officer refused to listen. Daniel stumbled backward, his confidence draining as the reality of his actions took shape. His mouth opened and closed like he was searching for an explanation, but none came. There was no justification for his behavior, no excuse strong enough to make sense of what had just happened. In that moment, the dynamic flipped entirely. Adrian was no longer the man being accused, he was the authority in the room. And the officer, who had moments ago tried to assert power through intimidation, now stood exposed, vulnerable, and painfully aware that his decisions would have consequences. The crowd remained frozen, tearing between shock, guilt, and a dawning understanding that they had all just witnessed something far more serious than a simple confrontation. The scene was no longer just dramatic, it was transformative, and it marked the beginning of a reckoning that no one at the country club had anticipated. As the golf club hit the ground and silence settled over the scene, the reality of what had just happened began sinking into the minds of every witness present. For a moment, no one moved. The peaceful country club atmosphere, usually filled with soft chatter, laughter, and the distant ping of golf balls, felt suddenly suffocating. Then slowly, reactions began to ripple through the crowd. A few club members stared wide-eyed at Adrian's badge, their faces growing red with embarrassment as they realized how quickly they had assumed the worst. Others shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact altogether as guilt gnawed quietly at them. A handful, those who had whispered to each other earlier, were now whispering again, only this time with regret, shock, and the unmistakable tone of people trying to distance themselves from their own earlier judgments. One older gentleman stepped forward, his voice trembling as he apologized to Adrian, admitting he should have spoken up when he first sensed things were escalating. A young woman nearby wiped tears of frustration from her eyes, horrified that a place meant to represent prestige and safety had become the stage for such hostility, but not everyone responded with remorse. A couple of club members grumbled under their breath, still convinced that the officer had just been doing his job, too stubborn or ashamed to acknowledge the role that bias had played. Their discomfort showed in the way they crossed their arms, casting glances around as if searching for someone to validate their perspective. Meanwhile, the officer stood frozen, face pale, shoulders rigid, the weight of his mistake settling heavily onto him. He watched as club members filmed him, this time not because they feared Adrian, but because they wanted proof of the officer's misconduct. The shift was undeniable. Moments earlier, the crowd had assumed Adrian was the threat. Now the officer was the subject of scrutiny, judgment, and disbelief. The energy had completely flipped, and Daniel felt it. He took a shaky step back, his mind racing with the consequences he knew were coming. His career, reputation, and credibility were dissolving right in front of him. Adrian, still holding his badge, felt the sting of what had happened, not because he needed validation, but because the situation had unfolded exactly the way he feared it might. Even with his calm demeanor, even with his membership, even in a place meant for leisure, he had been reduced in the officer's eyes to a threat. But instead of responding with anger, he simply lowered the badge and took a steady breath. His restraint, poise, and professionalism stood in stark contrast to the chaos that had been forced upon him, and everyone watching recognized it. For many, this moment became a lesson they would never forget, one that stripped away illusions of safety, exposed the cracks beneath their community's polished exterior, and set the stage for the storm of accountability that was about to follow. The hours after the incident felt like a blur, yet every detail would soon become part of an official record. As club managers hurried over, apologizing profusely and offering Adrian a private room to decompress, witnesses handed him their phone videos, clear, undeniable evidence of what had occurred. Adrian accepted them quietly, knowing they would be essential for what came next. By the time he left the club grounds, the officer's supervisors had already been notified. Complaints from multiple members began flooding the local police department, each recounting the same shocking moment, an officer attacking an innocent man without provocation. And when those complaints mentioned that the man was a federal agent, the department realized they were dealing with more than a public relations embarrassment. They were facing a professional and legal crisis. The Internal Affairs Division immediately launched a formal investigation, summoning Officer Daniel Cray for questioning within hours. He attempted to explain his actions, spinning vague claims about suspicious behavior, uncooperative movement, and possible threat indicators. But the IA investigators had already seen the footage. They had watched the officer ignore Adrian's calm explanations, escalate without reason, and weaponize a golf club in a situation with zero danger. They watched Adrian stand still, hands visible, voice steady, even when the officer swung at him. They watched the flimsy narrative fall apart, frame by frame. Every excuse Daniel tried to offer was dismantled by video evidence that left no room for interpretation. Meanwhile, Adrian was invited to provide his formal statement, one he delivered with clarity, detail, and unwavering professionalism. He described the moment the officer first approached, the hostility in his tone, the unnecessary aggression, and the dangerous misunderstanding that nearly turned deadly. IA officers listened closely, taking note not only of his words, but of his composure. They were used to seeing anger, frustration, or fear in situations like these, but Adrian's calmness carried a weight that made his account impossible to dismiss. And when he presented his badge, documents, and membership confirmation from the country club, the timeline of events became painfully straightforward. Adrian had been targeted not because of his actions, but because of assumptions rooted in prejudice. Internal Affairs expanded the scope of the review. They examined Daniel's past conduct, uncovering previous complaints, nothing as dramatic as this, but consistent patterns of aggressive behavior and questionable judgment. Combined with the current incident, these prior warnings painted a troubling picture. By the third day of the investigation, the department placed Daniel on administrative leave pending final disciplinary recommendations. News of the suspension spread quickly through the department, stirring debates among officers. Some felt betrayed by Daniel's reckless behavior, knowing it made their jobs harder. Others tried to defend him, insisting he just misread the situation. But the evidence told a much clearer story, one that could not be softened by excuses. The IA team prepared a final report that concluded the officer had violated multiple protocols, used unnecessary force, failed to follow de-escalation procedures, and displayed conduct unbecoming of law enforcement. The report didn't just suggest consequences, it demanded them. And as the department leadership prepared to take action, the city quietly braced for what would happen once this story inevitably reached the public eye. It didn't take long for the story to burst beyond the walls of the country club and the halls of the police department. In fact, it started with a single video, one shaky, stunned recording posted by a club member who couldn't believe what he had witnessed. Within minutes, it was circulating in local community groups. Within hours, it had spread across social media platforms with captions like "Unprovoked officer attacks innocent man" and "Golf club used as a weapon against a member." But the detail that truly ignited the public's outrage was the revelation that the man being attacked was a federal agent, calm, compliant, and offering no resistance whatsoever. The clip of the officer raising the golf club, followed by the moment he dropped it after seeing the badge, became the focal point of every discussion. Comment sections filled with shock, frustration, and disbelief as people replayed the footage frame by frame. By evening, local news stations picked up the story, featuring interviews with club members who had witnessed the incident firsthand. Some spoke with visible shame, admitting they should have intervened sooner. Others recounted how quickly the situation escalated, describing the officer's aggression and Adrian's composure in stunning detail. The officer's name, Daniel Cray, began circulating online alongside calls for accountability. Hashtags demanding justice trended across multiple platforms. Legal experts weighed in, pointing out the severity of the misconduct and the potential violations of both state and federal guidelines. Overnight, Daniel went from a relatively unknown patrol officer to a national headline, but not in the way any officer would want. As the story grew, the police department attempted to control the narrative, releasing a brief statement acknowledging an ongoing internal review. But the public wasn't satisfied with vague reassurances. Every major news outlet sought interviews with Adrian, though he declined, choosing instead to remain professional and silent as the investigation continued. Still, his quietness didn't diminish his presence. If anything, it made him appear even more dignified, contrasting sharply with the image of the officer who had swung a golf club at him. Civil rights organizations reached out, offering support. YouTubers, analysts, and commentators dissected the incident, discussing systemic bias, excessive force, and the danger posed by assumptions. What had begun as a peaceful day at a golf course was now a catalyst for national conversation. Meanwhile, the pressure on the department intensified. Protests formed outside the precinct, not violent but deeply passionate, chanting for justice and for meaningful reform. Community leaders demanded transparency. Politicians were asked to address how something like this could happen in a place meant to represent refinement and safety. Even members of the country club found themselves dragged into the media storm. Some questioned about the initial call that falsely labeled Adrian as suspicious. Slowly, the narrative widened from a single officer's actions to a broader conversation about who is seen as belonging and who is unfairly marked as a threat. And as the nation's attention zeroed in on the unfolding investigation, one truth became clear: this incident was not going to quietly fade away. It had become a story too big, too raw, and too revealing to be ignored. As the investigation wrapped up and the public conversations continued to echo across the nation, the story of Adrian Brooks and Officer Daniel Cray settled into its final chapter, a chapter that left everyone involved questioning the assumptions, fears, and biases that had allowed such a moment to occur in the first place. For Adrian, the whirlwind of attention was never something he sought. He didn't go to the golf course expecting to become the center of a national debate. He didn't want to be a symbol of injustice, or a headline reminding people of the subtle and not-so-subtle dangers faced by individuals who are constantly judged before they are understood. All he wanted was a peaceful morning and a chance to escape the intensity of his federal work. Instead, he was forced to confront the reality that even with a badge, a title, and a reputation built on integrity, he was not immune to being misjudged based solely on the color of his skin. Yet instead of responding with anger or seeking revenge, Adrian chose something far more powerful: clarity and accountability. He recognized that the issue was bigger than the officer, bigger than the club, and bigger than the single moment caught on video. It was a reminder, one seen far too often, that authority can be misused, assumptions can be dangerous, and silence from witnesses can allow injustice to grow unchecked. His decision to handle the matter with professionalism showed the world what strength truly looks like. Not loud, not aggressive, but calm, grounded, and unwavering in truth. And that composure forced everyone else involved, club members, the police department, and even the officer himself, to face that truth without excuses. The consequences that followed weren't just disciplinary actions for Daniel, they were lessons for the entire community. They forced people to ask difficult questions. How quickly do we judge someone? How often do we let appearances guide our fears? How do stereotypes shape our reactions before we even realize it? And most importantly, what would have happened if Adrian had not been a federal agent? If he had been someone without authority, without a badge, without a powerful platform to defend himself? That is the question that resonated most deeply, the one that made this story matter beyond the news cycle or the trending hashtags. It highlighted a truth that society cannot ignore. Safety, respect, and dignity should not depend on job titles or federal credentials. They should be afforded to every human being. In the days following the investigation, Officer Daniel Cray found himself standing at the center of a storm he never imagined would engulf his career. Once known within the department as a reliable, by-the-book patrol officer, he now carried the weight of a mistake that had rippled far beyond the academy gates. When the department announced that he would be making a public statement, anticipation filled the air, reporters gathered, community members assembled, and cameras lined the steps of the building like silent judges waiting to record every word. Daniel stepped up to the podium with shoulders noticeably heavier than before, his once confident posture replaced by a haunted humility. In his hands, a folded piece of paper trembled slightly, but before reading, he looked out at the crowd with an expression that revealed the truth. He wasn't just embarrassed, he was shaken by the depth of the harm he had caused. His apology began slowly, as though each sentence carried the weight of a lesson learned too late. He admitted his assumptions, acknowledged the stereotypes that influenced his behavior, and expressed remorse not only to Commander Hale, but also to the countless people who saw themselves reflected in her experience. He spoke about the training he thought he understood, the protocols he believed he followed, and the blind spots he didn't know he had until they exposed him in front of the world. There was no attempt to justify himself, no attempt to shift blame. Instead, he confronted the reality that his actions had betrayed the values he had sworn to uphold. As he spoke, the crowd remained eerily quiet, not in hostility, but in a collective understanding that accountability, though rare, was finally unfolding before their eyes. When Daniel finished, he stepped back from the microphone, and the silence lingered for a moment longer before the first reaction stirred. Some members of the community softened, seeing genuine remorse in his words and recognizing that growth sometimes begins at the breaking point. Others remained firm, demanding that apologies be matched with action, insisting that one speech could not undo years of unchecked assumptions embedded within systems of power. Yet regardless of where they stood, everyone agreed on one thing: this moment represented something meaningful. It was not closure, because true closure requires deeper change, but it was a spark, a rare acknowledgement from within the ranks that mistakes cannot be ignored simply because they come from authority. For Commander Hale, the apology was a necessary step, but not an end point. She quietly watched the broadcast from her office, understanding the personal courage it took to speak publicly, while also knowing that true accountability extends far beyond a microphone. Her focus remained on broader reforms, training revisions, new leadership expectations, and policy changes that would outlast any single incident. Still, she appreciated the sincerity in Daniel's voice, not because it erased the harm, but because it confirmed something essential. Truth, once brought to light, has the power to transform even those who once resisted seeing it. And in that transformation, the community found a sliver of hope. As the city buzzed with discussions, debates, and divided reactions to Officer Cray's apology, a quieter but far more consequential process was unfolding behind closed doors. Internal Affairs had spent days dissecting every second of the bodycam footage, cross-checking statements, reviewing training logs, and interviewing both eyewitnesses and academy staff. Their building, usually a place avoided by officers unless absolutely necessary, felt unusually intense, almost suffocating, as the case neared conclusion. Rumors drifted through the department like wildfire. Some believed Daniel would be fired without question, others thought his remorse might earn him a suspension instead, while a small but vocal group insisted the entire incident had been blown out of proportion simply because the victim happened to outrank him in ways he never imagined. Yet no one truly knew what verdict was coming, and the uncertainty created an atmosphere thick enough to feel in your throat. When the IA board finally convened for their last meeting, the stakes were unmistakable. This wasn't just about an officer swinging a golf club at a civilian. This was about the deeper, uncomfortable truth that he had done so based on a split-second assumption, one that revealed more about systemic patterns than about a single moment. The board members shifted through their papers with the kind of solemnity seen at high-level hearings. They reviewed the inconsistencies in Daniel's statements, the inappropriate escalation, and the breach of conduct guidelines that clearly outlined when and how force should be considered. Each board member recognized that their decision would set a precedent in a department already under public scrutiny. After hours of private deliberation, the verdict was written, sealed, and hand-delivered to the chief. The atmosphere in the building shifted. You could practically feel the tension ripple through the floors as the verdict quietly traveled from desk to desk. When the chief called Daniel into his office, the hallway fell silent, officers peeking discreetly from door frames as he walked past them with a mixture of dread and acceptance in his eyes. Inside the office, he sat across from the chief. No cameras, no crowd, no podium, just the raw truth waiting to be spoken. The chief's tone was firm but not cruel as he explained the findings. Daniel was found responsible for misconduct, excessive escalation, and violation of use of force policy. The punishment was severe but not career-ending. He would be suspended without pay, required to undergo intensive retraining, removed from field duty for 6 months, and placed under performance review upon return. For Daniel, the words strung far more than he expected. He had braced for termination, but somehow the reality of being forced to confront and correct his own failures felt heavier than losing his badge outright. Still, he nodded silently, accepting the verdict with a mix of regret and relief. Outside the office, whispers spread across the department, some calling the punishment fair, some calling it too light, and others seeing it as a rare moment where accountability had meaning. And in that complexity, something important shifted, a realization that the old way of looking at things could not stand unchallenged anymore. Internal Affairs had made a statement without shouting. The badge was not a shield for unchecked behavior, and the truth, once exposed, demanded consequence. In the week following Internal Affairs' final decision, Commander Hale found herself in the quiet stillness of her office long after most of the building had emptied. The city outside glowed with the soft orange of evening lights, but inside, only the lamp on her desk illuminated the stacks of reports, training manuals, and policy drafts she had been reviewing for hours. It wasn't the punishment handed to Officer Cray that occupied her thoughts, it was everything the incident revealed. For Commander Hale, this wasn't merely an unfortunate encounter or a disciplinary case. It was a stark reminder of how fragile the relationship between law enforcement and the community truly was, especially when assumptions and biases went unchecked. She leaned back in her chair, reflecting on the moment the officer raised that golf club, the panic in his voice, the disbelief in the crowd, and how quickly trust can dissolve when fear guides action instead of training. She thought about her own journey, how she had risen through ranks where few people looked like her, how she had endured assumptions, stereotypes, and tests of patience that her peers never faced. And standing at the intersection of authority and lived experience gave her a unique perspective. This incident wasn't just a misstep. It was a signal flare exposing weaknesses buried deep in the department's culture. She knew reforms couldn't just be cosmetic or reactive. They needed to address the subtle prejudices and blind spots that shape split-second decisions. They needed to reshape the way officers saw the people they served, and more importantly, the way they saw themselves. And so, in the stillness of her office, she began outlining a reform plan, updated de-escalation strategies, empathy-based training, bias recognition exercises, stricter accountability systems, and new protocols for interactions with civilians in unfamiliar or private settings. But her reforms went beyond techniques and manuals. She wanted to rebuild trust from the inside out. She proposed regular community roundtables where officers would listen, not lecture. She wanted mentorship programs that paired young recruits with experienced officers who valued integrity over intimidation. She wanted transparency, openness, and a cultural shift that didn't rely on fear-based authority but on earned respect. As she scribbled notes across her notepad, she felt a sense of clarity settle in. This incident could have ended in tragedy, but instead, it ended in revelation, a painful, necessary reminder that even those trained to protect can falter and that growth rarely begins in comfort. Leaning forward, she closed her notebook and exhaled deeply. She knew that implementing these reforms would not be easy. Resistance would come from those who felt exposed, threatened, or simply unwilling to change. But she had seen the consequences of inaction, and she understood the cost of silence. With steady resolve, she reminded herself that leadership wasn't about avoiding conflict. It was about confronting the truth and guiding others through it. And if her experience, strength, and determination could prevent even one incident like the one she endured, then every late night, every difficult conversation, and every challenging reform would be worth it. The path ahead was long, but Commander Hale was ready to walk it, not just for herself, but for every officer, every civilian, and every community that deserved better. A few days after Commander Hale finalized her reform proposals, the police department hosted a long-awaited community forum, an event that had grown into a symbol of the public's frustration, hopes, and demands for accountability. The auditorium was filled to capacity, with residents from every corner of the city present, business owners, students, activists, retirees, and families who had seen too many headlines echoing the same painful pattern. Tension mixed with anticipation as officers filed in, including many who looked uneasy, realizing that this was not the usual carefully controlled press conference. This was the community calling them forward, not to defend themselves, but to listen. And listening, truly listening, was something many of them had not been asked or forced to do before. Commander Hale entered last, drawing a quiet but powerful shift in the room's energy. She didn't sit at the center of the panel as the highest-ranking official. Instead, she chose a seat among the officers, signaling something symbolic. Leadership wasn't about sitting above others, but standing with them. When the forum began, the moderator opened with a firm reminder. This wasn't a night for empty statements. It was a night for truth, and the truth flowed from the community with raw honesty. Residents stood one by one, sharing stories of fear, mistrust, humiliation, and the exhaustion that comes from feeling unsafe around people who were supposed to protect them. Some spoke through tears, others through anger, but every voice held weight. And for the first time in a long time, officers sat silently, unable to hide behind badges or procedure. When it was Commander Hale's turn to speak, she didn't deliver a polished speech. Instead, she spoke plainly, acknowledging the department's failures and expressing her personal responsibility to push for change. She explained the reforms she was implementing, not as an apology, but as a promise that the department would not repeat its mistakes. Her voice carried a rare mixture of authority and vulnerability, and the crowd felt the sincerity behind her words. She emphasized that policing could not be rebuilt with policies alone. It required relationships, transparency, humility, and accountability that did not disappear once the cameras turned off. The auditorium fell into a thoughtful silence as her words sank in. Then came a moment no one expected. Officer Daniel Cray stood up from his seat. Without being called on, without any prepared remarks, he stepped toward the microphone. A hush fell over the room as people recognized him, the officer at the center of the storm. His posture was tense, his voice unsteady, but his message was direct. He admitted he was wrong, not because IA told him so, but because he had seen the pain his actions caused. He apologized to the community, acknowledging that his mistake reflected a larger issue within the culture he had been part of. The room remained still, but not cold, more like a space collectively holding its breath, witnessing something unexpected. His honesty did not erase the harm, but it created a rare moment where accountability and humanity crossed paths. By the end of the forum, something profound had shifted. The tension didn't disappear, Systemic problems don't dissolve in a single night, but the walls between the community and the department felt thinner. People walked out still wary, still cautious, but also with a faint sense that perhaps change was possible, not through promises, but through continued pressure, consistent accountability, and leadership willing to confront uncomfortable truths. And as the lights dimmed and the auditorium slowly emptied, Commander Hale stood quietly in the back, her expression steady. She knew the road ahead was long, but for the first time, she felt the city and the department finally walking toward the same direction. As the days passed and the dust gradually settled, the story of the officer, the golf club, and the unexpected badge moment became more than just a viral incident. It transformed into a deeper reminder of how fragile justice can be when shaped by assumptions rather than truth. Commander Hale continued her work, pushing reforms that would take months, even years, to fully blossom, while Officer Cray dedicated himself to rebuilding the trust he had broken, humbled by the consequences of his actions. The community, though still cautious, began engaging in conversations that once felt impossible, finding power in unity and in the newfound transparency forced into the spotlight. What started as a single confrontation on a quiet training field had rippled outward, revealing not just the flaws in one officer's judgment, but the cracks within an entire system long overdue for reflection. And through it all, the badge Hale carried, once dismissed in a moment of panic, became a symbol not of authority alone, but of transformation made possible when truth refuses to remain hidden. In the end, this story wasn't about embarrassment or punishment. It was about what happens when people choose growth over pride, accountability over denial, and courage over comfort. It was about the power of a moment to force change where silence once prevailed. And for anyone watching, it stood as a reminder that justice isn't automatic. It's something communities must demand, officers must uphold, and leaders must protect with unwavering resolve. Stories like this matter because they reveal hard truths, spark necessary conversations, and remind us that respect, both given and earned, is a foundation no society can afford to ignore. Thank you, Swifttail family, for joining me on this powerful journey. If this story made you think, if it sparked a conversation, or if it opened your eyes to something new, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. And don't forget, drop a comment below and tell me your thoughts. Your voice matters, your perspective matters, and together we keep these important stories alive. Until next time, stay aware, stay inspired, and stay strong.